Hello and welcome. Welcome to the Emmanuel Centre on this cold, wintry night here in London for what I am sure will be an impassioned Intelligence Squared debate. Absolutely fantastic that we have pretty well a full house tonight to debate the motion, the West should cut ties with Saudi Arabia. This is an issue, many of you will know, which came into sharp focus in October with the murder of this prominent Saudi journalist, Jamal Khashoggi. And the crime is not going away. Last night, millions of people saw Jamal's smiling face during an ad which appeared during America's premier sporting event, the Super Bowl. And the issue is not going away when it comes to relations, be it political, military, economic, diplomatic, with the Saudi kingdom and its de facto ruler, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince. Saudi Arabia is the driving force in a devastating war in Yemen, but it carries great political weight across the region and beyond. It's carrying out unprecedented social and economic reform, but there's continuing restrictions on women's rights and repression of dissent. And Saudi Arabia matters when it comes to global oil and financial markets. The ties matter, but should they be kept or should they be cut? Ladies and gentlemen, that is our motion for tonight. All of you who came in here tonight have already voted on the motion. We will soon hear the opening speeches of our excellent panel, and then I will announce the results of the first vote, all of what you had to say when you came in here tonight. Then there'll be your questions from the floor. Excellent questions, I'm sure, concise and to the point. Please don't make the democratic moderator into a dictator. Our first speaker for the motion is Mehdi Hassan, known, I'm sure, to many of you. Prominent journalist, outspoken broadcaster, a star of Al Jazeera television. He's the host of Upfront and Head to Head. He is also a columnist for The Intercept. He's host of the Deconstruct podcast. And our first speaker tonight, ladies and gentlemen.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I stand before you tonight to make the case for the motion. And as I do, a number of names and faces flash through my mind. People who are counting on me and on you tonight to speak for them in this debate, to give them a voice tonight with your votes. Lujain al-Hathrul, for example, a young women's rights activist who was jailed in 2014 for trying to drive her car in Saudi Arabia. Upon her release from prison, she went to live in the UAE, where last March she was grabbed on the side of the freeway, put in cuffs, thrown on a private jet, and taken back to Saudi Arabia against her will. Today, aged just 29 years old, she sits behind bars for the temerity of asking for women to have the right to drive. Lujain, according to her sister, as we speak tonight, is being held in solitary confinement, where she's been beaten, waterboarded, electrocuted, sexually harassed and threatened with rape and murder. Isra al-Ghamgham is also 29 years old. She's a young Shia human rights activist arrested with her husband in 2015 for carrying out peaceful protests, not for anything violent. And yet Saudi prosecutors are seeking to behead her, to execute her. She would be the first female human rights activist to be executed in this way. According to Human Rights Watch, Isra has not been charged or convicted with any acts of violence or even anything, quote, resembling recognizable crimes. The blogger Raif Badawi had his 35th birthday last month behind bars. He hasn't seen his kids for 7 years. He was sentenced for the crime of apostasy to 10 years in prison and 1,000 lashes. Lashes. 50 of which he's already had to endure. His wife says his health has deteriorated in prison and he won't survive another round of flogging. Flogging. Amal Hussein was 7 years old. A little girl in Yemen, the same age as my daughter. She posed a threat to no one. And yet there she was in that harrowing photo in the New York Times last November, her emaciated body, her stick-like arms. Within a week of that report, she was dead, literally starved to death. We in the West saw her picture, we saw her haunting eyes, and yet we did nothing to help her. We've done nothing to help the other 1.8 million severely malnourished children in Yemen who are suffering from a famine and a cholera crisis caused by a Saudi-imposed blockade. And then there's Jamal Khashoggi. Jamal, who was sitting with me in the green room at Al Jazeera English last March as we joked about his security while the Crown Prince was in town in DC. Less than 7 months later, he was dead. Brutally murdered inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, his body allegedly cut to pieces with a bone saw. And murdered, remember, according even to the CIA, on the direct orders of the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Ladies and gentlemen, let's not forget these people tonight in this debate. Lujain, Isra, Raif, Amal, Jamal, people who have been killed, dismembered, tortured, flogged, imprisoned, starved, sexually assaulted at the hands of our ally, our close friend, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Tonight we come together to demand accountability, to demand justice, to demand an end to impunity, an end to economic and political blackmail. Tonight it's time we make clear that the West needs to cut its ties with Saudi Arabia, especially military ties, arms sales, weapons exports, bombs. Now I'm guessing we'll hear a lot of whataboutism tonight from the opposition, a lot of excuse-making from the opposition. What about Qatar? What about Turkey? What about Iran? Defenders of Saudi Arabia often say. And those countries, yes, have major human rights abuses. Trust me, I know I've interviewed the leaders of all of them, including the Qataris, and asked them about those human rights issues. But let's be clear, tonight's debate is about Saudi Arabia. Don't allow yourself to be distracted by the opposition. But also, here's the thing to remember. When it comes to dictatorship, when it comes to women's rights, when it comes to the export of extremism and sectarianism, when it comes to the funding of terrorism, none of those other countries come close to Saudi Arabia. The Saudis are the Premier League champions at this stuff. We all know that. It's not breaking news. I doubt even the Saudi defenders here in this hall tonight will contest this point. They know it. What they'll try and say to you, I'm guessing, is that yes, knowing what we know about Saudi Arabia, we should all be concerned. We should all be upset. We should all be outraged. But we shouldn't do anything about it. We certainly shouldn't cut any of our ties because, remember the whataboutism, what about the cost of cutting ties with Saudi Arabia, they'll say. What about the fact that our economies need Saudi Arabia? Which isn't a fact, by the way, it's complete hyperbole. In 2017, US exports to Saudi Arabia accounted for a whopping 1.1% of US exports. In 2016, here in the UK, British exports to Saudi Arabia accounted for 1.3% of overall UK exports worldwide. What about the oil, they say? Well, the United States is now the world's biggest producer of oil. In fact, the US has produced more oil than Saudi Arabia for 4 straight years in a row. By the way, isn't it about time we stopped allowing the Saudis to use their oil to try and blackmail the rest of the world? What about intelligence sharing, they say? What about the war on terror? President Trump said last November that we can't abandon the Saudis because, and I quote, they're leading the fight against radical Islamic terrorism. What? Are you kidding me? We're supposed to thank them for trying to sort out the terrorism problem that they helped start? And before we forget, Saudi Arabia is allied on the ground in Yemen right now with Al-Qaeda. They're working with Al-Qaeda on the ground, according to reporting both by the BBC and the Associated Press. They're also the second largest source of foreign fighters to ISIS. 2,500 Saudis have signed up with that group. And as a leaked US State Department cable famously put it, donors in Saudi Arabia constitute the most significant source of funding to Sunni terrorist groups worldwide. So ladies and gentlemen, asking the Saudis to help lead the fight against terrorism is like asking the mafia to help lead the fight against organized crime. It's like asking Donald Trump and his kids to lead the fight against nepotism and corruption. It's absurd. Let's be serious here. There is a reason why the Algerian novelist Kamal Daoud famously wrote that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is basically an ISIS that's made it. and ISIS that's made it. So why? Why? Why are we so closely allied with such a kingdom? Well, what about Iran? They say we need Saudi Arabia against Iran, even though the last time I checked, there were 15 Saudis on those planes, not 15 Iranians. But even if you're worried about the threat posed by Iran, note how every step that the Saudis have taken in recent years has helped and empowered Iran. They bombed Yemen and pushed the Houthi rebels closer into the arms of Iran. They blockaded Qatar and pushed Qatar and Iran together. They prompted the Iraqi government to invite in Iranian militias to fight in Iraq against insurgent groups, many of whom were quietly backed by the Saudis. MBS, Mr. Bonesaw himself, the Saudi crown prince, who was behind almost all of those decisions, he's basically the reverse Midas. Everything he touches turns to shit, right? It's the reverse Midas effect. And that is the ally. That's the ally we need to cut ties with. That's the man, the ruler who we need to keep our distance from, both metaphorically and physically. And let's be clear, this is not about attacking Saudi Arabia, the country. I want to be clear tonight. Or being anti the Saudi people. It's about standing up to an out of control and pernicious Saudi government. In fact, we've screwed over the Saudi people for decades. Opposition groups, religious minorities, women's rights activists, journalists, dissidents. We have thrown them under the bus by cozying up to the Saudi regime, by propping up the Saudi regime, by deepening our ties with Riyadh instead of cutting down our ties with Riyadh. Let's also be clear about the wording of this admittedly awkwardly worded motion that we have before us. Cut ties doesn't mean blockade them or bomb them. It doesn't mean we treat Saudi Arabia like Saudi Arabia treats Yemen. We're not calling for regime change either. But what it does mean is we no longer treat them as our BFF in the Middle East. We no longer supply them with bombs that they then use with our assistance to flatten schools, hospitals, bakeries, flour mills, power stations across the poorest country in the Arab world. It means we no longer cover for them at the United Nations or help get them a seat on the UN Human Rights Council, as David Cameron so shamelessly did. It means we do not call on our governments to roll out the red carpet for the Saudis every time they come to town, as Crispin literally did on the BBC last March, roll out the red carpet for MBS. That's what we mean by cutting ties tonight. That's what we're arguing for. That's what we want you to vote for tonight. Because, ladies and gentlemen, there's a lot of people out there watching this debate. They're going to be watching on YouTube elsewhere. Saudi princes, Saudi trolls, arms dealers, the torturers outside Lujain al-Hathalul's prison cell. We need to send them a message that tonight we draw a line in the sand and we say no more. We will not allow you to thumb your nose at international law. We will not allow you to ignore basic global norms of decency and human rights. We will not allow you to get away with cold-blooded murder in Istanbul. We will not allow you to strangle an entire country and create the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, you all know full well that it is well past time to draw that line in the sand, to cut ties with Saudi Arabia, to stop treating them as an ally, a friend, when they are none of the above. Send that message tonight. Vote for the motion tonight. Thank you very much for your time.
Your hands will get tired if you clap too long for every speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, our first speaker against the motion, who very much enjoyed Mehdi Hassan's intervention. Mamoun Fandi, Egyptian-born, expert on the Middle East, eloquent speaker, or so they say. He's the president of the London think tank, London Global Strategy Institute, and he's the author of Saudi Arabia and the Politics of Dissent. Mamoun Fandi's interests, I'm told, include politics of the Arab world, terrorism and radical Islamic politics, regional security issues in the region, and definitely intelligence squared, since he came out of his sickbed tonight to join us. Please welcome him, ladies.
Thank you. Good evening, and I would like to thank the organizers very much for inviting me to participate in this. I have to admit it's certainly very difficult to come after the young and handsome Mehdi with a full head of hair to argue against the motion. I would like to really take issues with three areas that I would like to debate calmly and dispassionately. One is the issue of should the West cut ties with Saudi Arabia? What West? I mean, we're talking about an international system made of nation states, an international order that's made of international law. So the idea that there is something called a West suggests a great deal of hierarchy in values, that the West can act on behalf of international law, on behalf of humanity, that Africa doesn't exist, Asia doesn't exist, nowhere else the morally superior West can act on behalf of everybody else and cut ties with Saudi Arabia. I mean, we've seen how the West acts in 2003 on the attack on Iraq. And if the case of the horrible murder of Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul and the alleged cut-off parts of his body, as Mehdi said, one can also look at Abu Ghraib prisons. Did the West cut ties with the United States? Was the United States brought to an international crime tribunal for these abuses? So the idea of really just creating a special yardsticks for countries that we don't like is not very helpful for the notion of international law and order. My dear friend Mehdi said he is not really against Saudi Arabia and he's not insulting Saudi Arabia, but in the same breath he says Saudi Arabia is an ISIS that made it. So it is the same attitude that people take. If you don't like a country, you can use epithets and so on just to make a point. Now, Saudi Arabia is certainly not a Jeffersonian democracy, but Saudi Arabia is a country that's made out of the desert sand, and it continued probably for the last 300 years, various generations, and is very important for Muslims worldwide. For 1 billion Muslims who pray 5 times to Mecca every day, Saudi Arabia is very important. So the idea of just taking Saudi Arabia lightly, like any other small state, like talking about small Liechtenstein or Benin or something like that, then we're really missing the whole point. Saudi Arabia is also, as Liz pointed out, very central to the stability of the global order of energy. And all of us, those who are old enough, remember the cutting of oil in the war in 1973, the boycott by the Arab states, and the kind of devastating effect that created for the international economy. Saudi Arabia is also very important for regional stability. It is not a small state, it's a very important state, and I don't think we should throw the baby with the bathwater because one horrible crime was committed. I take issues with my friend Mehdi, who made a point of Jamal Khashoggi, and Jamal, in the same way that he's a friend of Mehdi, is a friend of mine, and it pains me to talk about him that way. But I would remind Mehdi that at the same, probably 2 days later, after the death of Jamal Khashoggi, or the disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi, a Bulgarian journalist, Victoria Minerva, was killed, raped, and murdered in Sofia. Nobody held the regime in Bulgaria accountable. Nobody even talked about it or mentioned it because we just measure global issues with different yardsticks. I don't mind at all that we call on Saudi Arabia to respect human rights and Saudi Arabia to abide by the rule of law, but certainly we don't give a pass for everybody else because we don't like Saudi Arabia. Very importantly, I think all of us have to reflect on some of these issues. When one talks about should the West cut off ties with Saudi Arabia, it's very much like saying, should Canada lead on the problem in Venezuela? I mean, these are non-starters in realpolitik and the world of sane men and women who consider the world at large not one single issue at a time. I wonder, those of you who want the West to cut off ties can tell me, how do we cut off ties? And did it work anywhere else? I mean, the United States cut off ties with Cuba for God knows how many years, half a century, and Cuba remained, Castro remained, and Cuba became worse. The conditions of the Cuban people did not improve. The United States cut off relationship with Iran since the revolution of 1979. The Iranian regime still with us 40 years later. The United States cut off ties with North Korea, and back the United States trying to cut deals with West Korea. So when we talk about how can we do this, I mean, as sane, reasonable people, it's reasonable to call on Saudi Arabia to respect human rights. It is reasonable to have very targeted sanctions against individuals who committed crimes, but it is not reasonable to just isolate a whole country. Secondly, arguing against Mehdi here, first of all, in a world of sovereign states, where every nation is sovereign, has its own laws and regulations, why Saudi Arabia is different? Saudi Arabia came to us and said there is a judicial process in place to try those who committed the crime in Istanbul. What's wrong with waiting for this process to end? I understand a chuckle here and a chuckle there, but I think as sane people, we have to have a respect for national law as well as international law. But the idea of a crowd deciding, all of us, let's cut off relationship with this country or that country with no respect for international law or no respect for national law, then we are in the world of a jungle. I mean, how do we organize a very complex international community along those lines of the winners are the people that the crowd decides how to punish people? This is just basically unacceptable in a very complex world. Saudi Arabia decided that it will take issues with those who committed the crime. Now, all of us, there is a great deal of assumptions that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is behind the scene. I would like to see a video or an audio or something like that that links Mohammed bin Salman to this crime. I have yet to see it. I mean, here we are in, quote unquote, the West, where there is due process and people are innocent until proven guilty. Somehow we decided this man ordered things and he is absolutely guilty for committing this crime. Making these leaps and jumps justifies reason. And I think my problems, as somebody who came from Egypt, got education in the West, and believed in, quote unquote, the values of the West, I still believe that people are innocent until proven guilty. But just jumping, frog hopping here and there, try to link points that are not linked to satisfy a revenge that's burning inside us, and taking some scapegoat somewhere and linking a whole regime and a whole country to one crime. I think it's just, I would probably refer it as immature and romantic notion of international politics. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mahmoud Fandi, also young, also handsome. Our second speaker for the motion, Professor Mehdi Al-Rashid. She's a leading thinker on Saudi Arabia. She is from the kingdom, and her latest book is Salman's Legacy, The Dilemma of a New Era in Saudi Arabia. Mehdi Al-Rashid is a professor of social anthropology in the Middle East Center at the London School of Economics. Ladies and gentlemen, she has debated 2 other times this very issue that we confront tonight. She won 1 debate, she lost 1 debate. 3 times lucky or unlucky? Ladies and gentlemen, up to you to decide. Madawi Al-Rashid.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me to participate in this debate for the 3rd time. I will keep doing it as long as I have to. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. As you have noticed, I'm the only woman on the panel, and I'm also the only Saudi person on the panel. But let me put the Saudi word in inverted commas, because I need to tell you about a little history that is very personal. I came to Britain in 1983 as a young student who wanted to pursue her education at the most esteemed universities in Britain. I went to Cambridge, I did my master, and also I did my PhD. As I finished my PhD in social anthropology, looking at the history of Saudi Arabia, my father got a phone call from nobody but Prince Salman at the time. He was the governor of Riyadh. And Prince Salman conveyed the information to my father that if I publish my PhD thesis, I will be subjected to disciplinary action, whatever that means. Well, of course, I went ahead and published my dissertation and published another 14, 15 books afterwards. I remained Saudi, living in Britain, moving to different jobs, becoming a professor at British universities here in London, first at King's College, and then I moved to LSE. But in 2005, I got another phone call from my father, who was informed by the King of Saudi Arabia that my Saudi nationality was withdrawn. So, luckily, I was a British citizen by that stage. Why was it withdrawn? Because I went on television to object to the fact that Saudi women were deprived of participating as voters and candidates in the municipal elections. We're not talking here about national elections, a parliament, God forbid, because in the Saudi Islamic tradition, our constitution is the Quran, and there is no need for elected parliaments because the king knows it all, and he can decide for everybody. So I lost my Saudi passport, but my story is not unique. You probably have heard in the last 2 weeks the story about Rahaf al-Qunun, who escaped from Saudi Arabia, ended up in Thailand, and then Canada luckily accepted her as an asylum seeker. According to the United Nations, UNHCR, there are now over 2,000 Saudi asylum seekers going to the United States, to Canada, and Britain. So this wealthy country, where we are told that British expats love to go and work there and earn untaxed salaries, want to go to that country, we find that the Saudi men and women are leaving the country. So if you're worried about migration and asylum seekers, we are heading towards a crisis in Saudi Arabia. Today, Saudi Arabia is a pressure cooker on the verge of implosion, simply because the so-called reforms of the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, who is hailed by the international media, from the New York Times to the Washington Post to our press here in Britain, is the great revolutionary reformer. He allows Saudis to go to concerts, and he allows women to attend football matches if accompanied by their male guardians. So this top-down revolution that is happening is producing asylum seekers, is producing the people, the real people who have been mentioned by my colleague Mehdi Hassan. So from women activists, from people who are simply tweeting, People who are at university, my colleague Hatoun El-Fassi, she studied in Manchester University. She is an archaeologist specializing in deciphering the inscription of the Nabatean civilization in the north of Saudi Arabia, that Mohammed bin Salman wants to become a tourist attraction. Encouraging you, the educated audience, to go and see this archaeological site. She specializes in deciphering the inscriptions of this ancient civilization. She is now in prison and has been since June 2018. Her crime, nobody knows. According to the Saudi press, we have the front pages of the Saudi-owned newspapers talking about these women activists who had been put in jail as traitors, as agents of foreign governments. I myself is called also a traitor, an agent of the British intelligence services, simply because I write books, enjoy the freedom of speech that this country allows me and my own country deprives me of. So, if we're talking, I do agree with my colleague Mamoun when we say the West. I don't like these generalizations. In as much as I don't like the idea that there is a Muslim world out there or an Arab world. No, we're talking about individual countries. In Britain, for example, we are always told that we can't shun those people who torture their own citizens, who bomb other countries. We have to have constructive engagement with them, a dialogue with them. My colleague here, the right honorable gentleman, Crispin, asked the Saudi embassy to allow him to go to Saudi Arabia or allow a team to investigate the alleged torture of women activists. And what did the Saudi embassy do? Didn't reply, I understand. So the constructive engagement is supposed to, in the British government's rhetoric, successive governments, is meant to do behind-the-door diplomacy, talk about the British citizens who are tortured in Saudi prisons. We won't talk about them publicly, but we will put pressure on the Saudi government to change its behavior. So far, I do not see any change of behavior. Women activists are put in prison, tortured also, and I cannot see that this situation has changed. So the domestic situation is really bad. But we can't express or expect different Western governments to cut ties with Saudi Arabia. By cutting ties, I mean the different Western governments should suspend their unconditional support for the Saudi regime and underline the word unconditional support. So when MBS orders the killing of a journalist, until now, we don't give him an ultimatum, whereas we give the Venezuelan president an ultimatum to have elections. And we don't regard that as interfering in the sovereignty of the Venezuelan people. But when it comes to Saudi Arabia, oh, no, we can't interfere because those people are ruled by Sharia, some kind of Islamic law, that they are not like us. We exoticize them. We make Saudis look as if they are extraterrestrial, that they are governed by a law that is not shared by humanity. When the Saudi regime abuses its own people, it's violating international values and norms, and we have to be responsible for that. At the international level, how do we boycott a country? How do we put pressure on a country? Well, my friend gave the example of Cuba, but remember that Britain, the US, are the main suppliers of the weapons that Saudi Arabia uses to destabilize the region rather than create stability. In Lebanon, they forced the prime minister to resign to precipitate a crisis. In Bahrain, they intervened to derail the democracy impulse in 2011. And in Qatar, they fractured the solidarity of Gulf countries. In Yemen, I don't need to tell you about Yemen, the poorest country of the Arab world. So, ladies and gentlemen, you are an educated audience. Your vote is extremely important because you're sending a message to our government here in Britain and around the world, as this debate will be seen by so many people outside this country. You are sending a debate rejecting this unconditional support, the carte blanche that the Saudi regime gets from different Western countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Madawi Al-Rashid. Last but not least, our last speaker against the motion, Crispin Blunt, regarded as one of the most experienced foreign policy voices in the UK Parliament. Of course, you may say, how many foreign policy voices are there in the UK Parliament? It's a voice that's often heard on Saudi Arabia. As Madawi Al-Rashid mentioned, he was part of an MP's panel that went to Saudi Arabia to consider the jail conditions for Saudi women activists. It was published today and concluded that their jail conditions could be akin to torture. He's the Conservative MP for Reigate chair, and he was chair of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee from 2015 to 2017. Welcome to Crispin Blunt against the motion.
Yes, thank you very much for that introduction, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Many thanks to Intelligence Squared for organising this debate and inviting me to speak on the side of the opposition. Nothing bumpy about this particular track I'm batting on. But many thanks to the previous speakers who have illustrated many of the issues at stake here. And during my 21 years as a Conservative Member of Parliament, I have consistently defended the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's important relationship with the United Kingdom. And I have supported continuing UK arms exports to the Saudi-led coalition operating with unanimous international endorsement in the Yemen. And indeed, as has been pointed out, I did welcome the visit of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to the UK last year. And I suspect many of you, without knowing who I am, seeing that a Conservative Member of Parliament was arguing against this motion, might have been unsurprised, unchallenged by your expectations. However, I hope you are ready to hear a more nuanced point of view and that I can challenge your expectations. Now, I first met Mohammed bin Salman when leading a Commons Foreign Affairs Committee on a visit to Riyadh in December 2015. And over a meeting lasting an hour and a half, I confess I was impressed by his strategic grasp and his ability to engage on all questions on all fronts. I've also made countless diplomatic and parliamentary visits to the region since 1993, when I became the Foreign Secretary's then Special Advisor. So I hope I have a decent understanding of the realities of the region, at least by parliamentary standards. Therefore, it is I who perhaps am most disappointed with the current state of the kingdom. And I have acute anxieties for its future and the implications that has for the region. And to that end, I hope you will have the chance to glance at this report that I and two parliamentary colleagues, Layla Moran and Dr. Paul Williams, have published today. It was a detention review panel examining the conditions of 8 female detainees and 4 of their male supporters. And indeed, the name that Mehdi gave first in his speech is the first listed here, whose case we reviewed. And I accepted the task of reviewing the detention conditions of these women's rights activists and their male supporters, partly because I hoped I would command the confidence of both Saudi Arabia and its critics for actually being fair. I'm the man who chaired a Foreign Affairs Committee report on Brexit 3 times, 3 different reports, and brought them all home unanimously, despite a committee split down the middle. And I hoped that my engagement with the Gulf monarchies and public appreciation for the stability those rulers have brought to the Gulf Cooperation Council would lead to cooperation from the kingdom, emphasizing the panel's honest and independent nature. However, as I've already made clear, I am incredibly disappointed by the series of events that lie behind tonight's debate. And the murder of Jamal Khashoggi provides the most gruesome backdrop. Analysts made clear that our report concluded that the detainees have been subjected to cruel and inhumane treatment, including sleep deprivation, assault, threats to life, and solitary confinement. And their treatment is likely to amount to torture, and if they are not provided with urgent access to medical assistance, they are at risk of developing long-term health conditions. Torture is a crime of universal jurisdiction, and no nation that can claim to be a liberal democracy can, in all conscience, allow such heinous crimes to go unanswered. So, of course, we must evaluate our ties with Saudi Arabia. We must show the benefits of openness on society. We have a duty to help. Britain has levers of influence in the kingdom, and we should be intent on pulling them to influence where we can. Indeed, I believe we have a moral responsibility to do so. The picture in Saudi Arabia is as complex as the personality of its young crown prince. The moves of Mohammed bin Salman towards economic reform with Vision 2030 have been accompanied by wider social reform. The removal of arrest powers from the religious police. They have actually prepared the legislation for the easing of male guardianship laws, although it remains to be implemented. And the granting of women's right to drive and the opening of public places of entertainment stands as an incongruous contradiction when you lock up the individuals who were calling for these things in the first place. And I want to state very plainly that the attitude and the actions of the kingdom cannot be tolerated. And it has to be seen how our government in 2019 will recast its relations with Saudi Arabia, not only in the light of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, but with the active suppression of civil society that should accompany any claims of a monarchy that wishes to be at least overtly consultative. But we must address the motion itself. I agree with the analysis about the term of the West and how difficult that is. So I'm going to focus principally on the United Kingdom. But cutting ties, which I interpret as cutting all ties, otherwise this debate is simply about semantics, is a rare step in a diplomatic arsenal. Indeed, a full, unambiguous severing of ties is not a simple action. We reserve such decisions for countries we are at war with or who seek to subvert our institutions. The United Kingdom expelled 23 Russian diplomats in the wake of Russia's proved involvement in the attempted murder of the Skripals and the death of Dawn Sturgis, sending a strong diplomatic signal that Russia is a bad faith international actor. And I am under no illusions that the status quo with Saudi Arabia is acceptable. However, cutting all ties would amount to both self-harm and harm to the cause of reform in Saudi Arabia, but cutting some ties in certain areas may and indeed should be carried out. But defense, our principal relationship, illustrates the dilemma. I've historically defended British arms sales to the kingdom. And although a re-evaluation of our defense relationship must be on the table, severing this link would probably be highly detrimental to global security in the long term, whilst obviously painful for our economy and defense industry. But more importantly, we live in a loose, liberal, democratic, rules-based world order, underpinned by NATO, the US security umbrella, and of course the United Nations. And this has not always been the case. And indeed, it may be in reverse. Indeed, as a liberal democracy, we should do all in our power to prevent more authoritarian countries who place less value on the rule of law from becoming the dominant paradigm of the world. Cutting totally defense ties with Saudi Arabia would be a gift to increasing the values of China and Russia on the world stage. Right now, we have been able to improve their conduct of the Yemen operation and help them bring the Houthis and themselves and their allies to the peace table. One of the ironies of the relative ineffectiveness of the Saudi military efforts that have seen thousands die is that millions are now at the risk of starvation. And I don't think that's anything many of this in this room would wish for. A full disengagement with Saudi Arabia's armed forces will remove whatever British oversight exists. And do you really want to drive Saudi Arabia towards the re-education camps of Jiangxing, of Russian conduct in Chechnya and Syria, and that these countries who place such wretchedly low value on human rights, the integrity of the individual, and the rule of law. But let me illustrate with another dilemma over justice. I was dismayed when in 2015, Britain cancelled the contract for the Ministry of Justice to provide training for prison staff in Saudi Arabia, which had the admirable goal of providing advice on the improvement of its detention system. And I still maintain that that cancellation was populist nonsense. And whilst it may have been popular, it achieved nothing but a sense of moral satisfaction for the United Kingdom. We were able to assure ourselves that we had no part to play in a justice system which executes for offences that might not even be crimes in the United Kingdom. But we gave up on the chance to improve the Saudi prison system. And people don't respond well when they're scorned for doing something wrong. No one likes to be told on a bad day, even me, that they're wrong. It's much better to offer a solution, to engage and to explain to the other side why an alternative might be better. Megaphone diplomacy and the noisy condemnations will always be heard, humiliating the decision makers. Of course, public shaming and isolation of offending regimes has a place and can be a spur to progress. But in our instance, thumbing our noses at Saudi prisons merely hardened their attitudes and leading to the current wretched state of detention, which was one of the reasons I was happy to chair this panel. Now, Saudi Arabia has acknowledged once upon a time under King Abdullah, who said that reason rules the world, ethics rules the world, and these can rule the world. This can and should be the case. But we need to drag Mohammed bin Salman along these lines with whatever parts of pressure we can adopt. Otherwise, we have the prospect of an absolute monarchy, ruling terror, totally closing down the space for civil society in Saudi Arabia. And in the end, there will be revolution. And what will follow will be infinitely worse than what they have now.
Ladies and gentlemen, a big thank you to Crispin Blunt for speaking against the motion, and a big thank you to all of our speakers. Please give them another round of applause. Excellent speakers on a very important motion. The West should cut ties with Saudi Arabia. This is how you voted when you came in the Emmanuel Center this evening. For the vote, 41% of you said the West should cut ties with Saudi Arabia. 41%. 22 of you were against, and a big 37% of you came into this hall tonight undecided. And perhaps you are making up your mind right now. And now is the time for you to ask your questions. Where's number one? Where am I looking? Number one, who's going to have the honor of asking the first excellent question?
Hi, thank you so much. I thought it was a really interesting debate, and I'm really glad that I attended. I wanted to ask that the speakers for the motion that if the West does cut ties with Saudi Arabia, which I agree with all of your points, how do we ensure that the same thing doesn't happen in terms of civil war, like has happened in other Arab nations?
Thank you. Right over here, number two.
A related point, which is that we're very concerned in this country about the cutting of ties between Britain and Europe, which could come about through Brexit. If we have this cutting of ties between the West and Saudi Arabia, what comes after this? Saudi Arabia is such a central pillar of such an unstable part of the world. The proposition have completely failed to talk about what comes if they succeed in their desire to get to change a regime which they see as being abhorrent.
Thank you. And way in the back, number three.
It was a question for Mr. Blunt. You talked about countries that seek to subvert our institutions, but when BAE Systems were investigated for bribing Saudi officials, the Saudi government threatened British lives on British streets, and it was withdrawn. So I don't see them respecting our institutions.
Crispin Blunt, you'll have a minute to think about that. Mehdi al-Rashid, the first two questions were roughly the same. What will happen? Could be civil war, could be something worse if ties are cut. Mehdi.
Well, the assumption that if the Saudi regime falls, then we're going to have a civil war like in Syria, in Libya, etc. But we forget that the Saudi regime itself played an incredible central role in turning Syria into a sectarian war rather than a pre-democracy movement that wanted to gain all the rights that we enjoy here. The Saudis were the second cohort of jihadis who went to Syria to derail that impulse towards democracy. And Saudi Arabia is not just about conservatives and about jihadis. Of course, the name, the Saudi regime, is associated with violence that is practiced by terrorists in the name of Islam. But I did a study of a group of Saudis who were calling for civil society, exactly what Crispin was talking about. And those people had all been in prison.
Let's take the question. The question was, but whatever your disagreements with the kingdom now, if you cut ties, it will get worse.
Can I jump in on the stability point? I mean, this stability point, Mamoun mentioned it as well. Sorry, what stability? Have you checked out the Middle East recently? What stability are we referring to? Yes, a central pillar of an unstable region. Also, one of the central causes of the instability in that region. And you say we didn't make the case. Madawi went through the list. Lebanon, they kidnapped the prime minister. Allegedly, MBS slapped him around. Qatar, they undermined the Gulf Cooperation Council with a blockade that hasn't worked 2 years later. Syria, Madawi's made the point, they helped foment the jihadist part of the opposition. We all know what's happening in Yemen, where they're literally working with Al-Qaeda on the ground. I thought we were worried about Al-Qaeda. I thought we were fighting a war on terror for 17 years. And of course, don't forget, Saudi Arabia is one of the key forces with Netanyahu in Israel and John Bolton wanting to push for a new war in the Middle East in Iran, which will make Iraq look like a walk in the park. So what pillar of stability? What pillar of stability?
We have an answer to the question. Will it get worse if you cut ties? You're focusing on what there is now.
I'm not going to play counterfactuals. It's worse now. We're complicit in a war in Yemen now. I want to stop our complicity now. Not deal with kind of hypotheticals that it might get worse. It's horrible now, and Saudi's a big part of that.
Crispin Blunt, we heard a question about the BAE systems, and what you call constructive engagement is, she mentions threats.
I confess I haven't heard the explicit Saudi threat to British citizens on British streets.
It was under Blair.
However, what I am pleased about is the fact that our country not only has the toughest arms exports controls that I've found globally, but also has passed, both parties supported the passing of the Bribery Act in 2010 to make sure that our standards are consistently the highest in the world. There will always have been things wrong in the past. Of course there have. But what we need to be committed to is consistent improvement. And what we also need to be committed to is to try and rescue Saudi Arabia from the threat in the end of revolution. And if revolution happens in Saudi Arabia, do not think that there is going to be some nice, cozy regime, perhaps led by the al-Rashid family, who were replaced by the Sauds in the very first part of the 20th century. What will follow is likely to be very, very ugly indeed.
Okay.
Can I just jump in very briefly and ask Crispin one quick question? Your speech, you spent the second half of your speech telling us that we have levers of influence over Saudi Arabia, and you ended by saying it is much better to engage and explain. And yet you spent the first half of your speech telling us how the Saudis wouldn't let you in. I want you a walking example of why engagement and explanation doesn't work. You should be on this side of the house tonight, surely.
Well, and obviously that depends on your definition of ties. I am against cutting all ties with Saudi Arabia. And of course there need to be measures taken against Saudi Arabia for obviously the appalling murder of Jamal Khashoggi, but it is right to wait for at least there is a Saudi justice system operating, putting people on trial for what happened there.
Okay,
in total difference to the Russian view as to what they did about the attempt to murder the Skripals and indeed the
Let's get more questions from the honourable ladies and gentlemen of the floor. Question number 4.
Hi, thank you so much for everyone who's talked tonight. It's been fascinating. Firstly, so Crispin, I just want to take issue with the attitude you say that Britain has a civilizing influence on Saudi. This seems slightly almost harken back to colonial times to myself. I mean, given the fact that we have the war in Yemen, as discussed, atrocities wrought upon its own people, this just seems patently false. But my question really is that because the US aligns with Saudi as a large, in a large degree to part of its blanket support for Israel against Iran in the region, what will it take to remove this support?
Right here, question number 2 from the floor.
North Korea has its useful idiots in the UK and probably elsewhere in the form of tour operators and travel writers who do their damnedest to whitewash the regime or to delude visitors that they're seeing the real North Korea. If Saudi opens up to tourism, isn't there the risk of the same thing happening, doing immeasurable harm to those of us who are campaigning for human rights there? So I'd like to ask one or both of the speakers for the motion to say what can be done to prevent tourism taking over.
Okay, let's take this gentleman here right in the front row, and then we have one in the back.
The debate's been very much framed in terms of human rights, but I'd like to ask the audience to change the paradigm and look at this from a perspective of what is in the real political interests of Britain. Is Saudi a threat or not to the UK? The export of terrorism from Saudi, religious fundamentalism, etc. And how would Saudi compare to other significant countries in the region? If I were a Martian coming down to Earth, why is it that the West is historically so close to Saudi Arabia as opposed to other regimes in the region which might appear to be more liberal?
Okay, and we're going to take one here in this corner. Very good.
This is to the opposition. Do you not think that by not cutting ties with Saudi Arabia, we are telling authoritarian regimes that they can essentially do what they want, and that the West's moral responsibilities are essentially worthless when it really matters?
Well said. Great question.
Mamoun, would you like to respond to that question?
I'd like to respond to Mehdi first, because I think Mehdi made a point about like Saudi Arabia almost the ISIS that made it all the time, and this most horrible country on the face of the earth. All right, but the point is, imagine, I mean, if Saudi Arabia goes radical as you imagine it, it would make ISIS look like the Green Party of Germany.
But it was already radical.
It
was.
Okay,
when a country...
We've dealt with that issue.
Just 1 second.
That's okay.
One second, please. The second thing, I challenge the opposition. If they count, if they can name more than the 8 women activists in Saudi prisons, I challenge them beyond Lejan Hazlul and others in a region where countries in the neighborhoods have 60,000, 50,000 political prisoners.
Two wrongs don't
and
make
these
it right,
are, I'm not saying to. What I'm saying is
number.
there is a principle of proportionality. A country of 23 million has 8 women activists in prison. If that country was as ugly,
that's not true.
That's not true.
Everyone shall have their time.
Factually inaccurate statement.
Name 10.
The 8 women you're referring to.
Please.
He's asking me a question. He's telling me to name the names.
Does Crispin's report not bother you, Mamoun?
Your own partner has a report out that undermines
you.
you.
It bothers me. But what I'm saying is that we have to be mature enough to know that countries in the region, Iran, for example, has like 100,000 political prisoners. Egypt, my home country, has between 50 and 60 political prisoners, thousands, not 60
You made your point.
And
okay,
so
let's come back to the
having
questions.
it against Saudi Arabia is insane. I mean, just like politically insane.
The student has asked you, doesn't it give you...
I applaud you for taking the moral high ground. And one would kind of expect nothing less, one would hope, of a young idealist asking you a question like that. The only...
Patronising.
Oh, yeah. Grow up and live in the real world.
I'm not quite sure why I've said something wrong in describing you as a young...
you
appear to be young, and I'd rather hope you're an idealist. But the problem for policymakers is if you camp out on the moral high ground and you absolve yourself of responsibilities for what follows, you may then have to cope with what is going to follow because you've taken that option. It is, in many ways, it would be the easy thing to do, to say that we should cut all ties and have nothing more to do with them. But then we have nothing more to do with the consequences of what will follow. And I am profoundly anxious about what may now happen in Saudi Arabia. And I think we should be bending every effort to try and get Saudi Arabia back onto a track towards progress that is both economic progress and also social progress. And it has gone very badly wrong.
His specific question was, and we should have, his specific question was, won't it send a signal to others that they can get away with it? Not just Saudi Arabia. It will have a ripple effect.
Exactly. It's not just a
and the consequence of what we do will then be to drive them into the hands of nations like Russia and China, whose moral code is not one that I think any of us should want to share or support. And that would be the consequence of taking that position. The world is full of horrible, hard choices.
Mehdi, would you like to take the human rights question? Just the question, which is why is there a threat? All of this is being focused on human rights. We had a gentleman asking, well, what threat is there to the United Kingdom?
I mean, I completely agree. I don't push it in my speech because, you know, I have an issue with the whole war on terror discourse, but I do find it odd that people on the right who told us for years that we should be worried about terrorists under every bet, who tell us that Muslims are all extremists, who tell us that mosques are funding radicalism, don't seem to care that one of the major countries, perhaps the major country, behind a lot of the ideology is Saudi Arabia. That's what even right-wing think tanks like the Henry Jackson Society, which I'm no fan of, produce reports saying Saudi Arabia is the foremost chief proponent of Islamist funding in the UK. So I do find that to be a problem. And this is not just a moral point. The young gentleman made a very good point. This is not just about morality. This is about consequences. If you say to them, you can do whatever you want, if they kidnap the Lebanese prime minister, if they blockade Qatar, if they carry on funding jihadists in Syria, if they kill journalists in consulates.
Torture British citizens, accusing them of manufacturing alcohol, putting them in Saudi jails. So we're talking about 30,000 British expats who live in Saudi Arabia.
But if they do all this without any consequence, that is a problem. And sorry, this is not about liberal or young people. Lindsey Graham, Senator Lindsey Graham, who you know well, one of the most hawkish Republican members of the Senate, hardcore supporter of Saudi Arabia, says, and I quote, "We don't want to give a green light to others that they can go down this road." He says he will not support Saudi Arabia while it is run by this reckless crown prince. And he is no liberal.
Mehdi, yes. Yeah. Would you like to take the question of the lady?
Yes. Yeah. We're not asking every British citizen in this hall to care about the plight of Saudi detainees. Yes, I don't want to get stuck in a human rights argument. We are realists, we understand politics, but it is in the interest of the British people not to have unconditional support for a regime like Saudi Arabia. In 1980, somebody asked a question about how they corrupt our institutions here in Britain. You're absolutely right. In 1980, Saudi Arabia cut diplomatic relations with Britain because there was a film shown on one of the British channels called Death of Princess about a princess who wanted to marry a commoner and she was beheaded, right? So 9 months of no diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Britain. In just last summer, when a Canadian foreign minister criticized the detention of women activists, what did Saudi Arabia do?
Lost their minds.
They kicked out the Canadian ambassador. And Germany criticized Saudi Arabia when it tried to destabilize Lebanon. What happened? They canceled all the armed sales with Germany. Sweden, again, women activists. The plight of women activists and the situation in Saudi Arabia was criticized in Sweden, and immediately they called the passport. Yes, Saudi Arabia doesn't behave in a civilized manner when it comes to diplomatic relations. Yes, Britain didn't cut diplomatic relations with Russia after they attempted to kill 2 Russians on our soil here, but Saudi Arabia is very quick to cut relations with Britain if Britain uttered one word of criticism. If we take the example of Canada and the rest of the world.
Crispin, there was... So, Crispin,
I can assure you the last thing.
There was a question to you about your use of the word civilizing influence, and a question which was looking also at the relationship with the United States.
But let's be clear, the last thing I'm arguing for is unconditional support for Saudi Arabia.
You literally said roll out the red carpet for MBS.
Yes, because...
Which is not the same thing as unconditional.
That is not the same thing. And having met him and been, I confess, impressed by his this young man being presented to us, as we were briefed before we went in, you will be surprised by his grasp of affairs, which was 1-to-1 or 1-to-4 the MPs there over a prolonged period, is impressive. This is why he went to the United States and wowed audiences from one end of the United States to the other, and had the ability to communicate in all sorts of different ways with other people. Now, what we've then seen, what we have then, this is part of the complexity. This is part of the complexity. But this is part of the complexity we have got to deal with. This is the same guy who almost certainly approved the operation against Jamal Khashoggi. This is the same guy whose chief intelligence officer appears to have overseen the mistreatment of women detainees in Saudi Arabia. This is the same guy who has now drawn all the levers of power into his own hands in Saudi Arabia. And yes, I think the best thing would be, frankly, is if Saudi Arabia could find itself another ruler. Of course, whether you will then going to overthrow the entire system on that basis is another question. But that is going to be a decision for the Saudis to take. And it's the challenge that we have to... It's the challenge that we...
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let us take a few more questions from the floor. Question number 1, please.
Hypocrisy.
We have an advocated regime, should they have...
Yeah, as a convert to Islam when I was 20 years old, that was 5 years ago, I would like to ask the panel, both sides, isn't Saudi Arabia complicit in this export of fundamentalist, puritanical, jihadi concepts? And it's infected mosques and young people all over the Western world. Don't you think that somebody should call the governments of the West need to call Saudi Arabia to account for what they're doing? And they're funding these mega preachers.
So are you saying they should, excuse me, were you saying they should cut ties or keep ties?
They should cut ties with Saudi Arabia in some form or another, to hold them responsible for their distortion of Islam, which has led so much.
Thank you, sir. Over here.
Hello. My name is Naif Harbi. I'm from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And why the people who speak positively about Saudi Arabia are voiceless? I moved to the West in 2014, and I learned a lot from the West. And actually, I am the founder of the first interfaith organization inside Saudi Arabia. And if you cut ties with Saudi Arabia, how are you gonna change the people? How are you gonna change their minds? 2014, I was watching Al Jazeera, and that's the platform of Osama bin Laden. And that's a lot of problems was there. I lost a lot of family members because terrorist attack inside Saudi Arabia. And when I want to talk positively about Saudi Arabia, I don't really have a voice. And as Mehdi said...
Your question, sir?
As Mehdi said, I am a troll, so that's what's going on. Why the Saudi citizens who talk positive about their country are voiceless in the Western media. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. And way up in the back.
Hi. So it's just to gain a bit more clarity and specificity, really, from the proponents on the motion of exactly how this would play out. So should the West cut ties with Saudi Arabia? It's open to some interpretation, okay? It's got some ambiguity in there. So a variety of different policy positions and examples from around the world and throughout history have been alluded to so far. So one person mentioned Venezuela and the way in which the West has exerted pressure on them, but without entirely cutting off ties with them. The opponents of the motion have repeatedly referenced North Korea, Iran, and Cuba as examples of countries where we've entirely, completely cut off ties. But there are a few other countries which also are worth mentioning. So, for example, in South Africa, during the apartheid era, there were specific targeted sanctions which had certain demands upon them. It wasn't, we're going to cut off ties with you forever.
So is your question then whether it's possible to maintain ties but do something short of cutting completely?
My question to the proponents of the motion is specifically, if you were the foreign minister for the UK, what would be your exact, precise strategy? What would be your policy? So without the sort of restating your moral position, what strategies would you use? You've talked about not rolling out the red carpet, you've talked about not selling arms, but what other concrete practical strategies would you adopt?
Okay, that's something that perhaps we can deal with in a bit more depth. But let me, so you've given the role of the Foreign Minister of the United Kingdom. I think if you've given that to Crispin or to Mamoun, or maybe to Madawi, actually. Mamoun, let's get you to, we've heard that the best way to stop the distortion of Islam is to cut off ties. It's a very strong message.
I'm not sure, there is a great deal of factual errors being peddled here. When we talk about Saudi Arabia spreading radical Islam, we have to remind people that it was the basic radical organization started in Egypt in 1928 under Sayyid Qutb. The ultimate ideologue of Salafi jihadism is Abu al-A'la al-Maududi, came from subcontinent. I dare anybody say that there is a Saudi who has the same standing as Maududi or as Sayyid Qutb or as Hassan al-Banna. There is none. I mean, these are followers. Saudi Arabia was taken over by the Muslim Brotherhood at some point when Nasser drove them out of Egypt. Then Zbig Brzezinski during the Cold War recruited Saudis.
Short history of Mamoun.
Recruited Saudis to go and fight in Afghanistan as part of mini client states, and under the leadership of none other than Osama bin Laden, as my friend pointed out, the very close friend of Al Jazeera network, who had the exclusive rights to all his tapes and interviews. So this is.
So you dispute his entire question that Saudi Arabia.
There's a myth being peddled that Saudi Arabia is the bedrock of the whole thing. The whole thing is.
So you dispute the question that it's not distorting Islam. It's not factual. Okay.
It's factual error.
Okay.
Mehdi, can I respond?
A question from the kingdom.
Yeah.
He's asking, why don't you give more positive news about what's happening in Saudi Arabia?
There's lots of positive news. The idea that positive news about Saudi Arabia is missing, or the idea that Saudis don't have a voice in the Western media, Saudi Arabia has one of the biggest army of lobbyists of any country in the Western world. They have op-eds. Conference. I live in Washington, D.C. There are conferences, think tanks sponsored by the Saudi government all the time. There are op-eds in U.S. newspapers sponsored. Some of them are written by the Saudi government and handed out to U.S. politicians to publish under their names. So this is absurd, the idea that Saudi Arabia doesn't get a hearing in the Western press. As for the idea that Al Jazeera is a friend of bin Laden, it's an absurd claim been made for many years, but I find it ironic that Al Jazeera is being blamed for Osama bin Laden, who was a Saudi national last time I checked. And just one point I must make, Mamoun, although he was stripped of it as well. But let me just make one very quick point to Mamoun. Mamoun, I've got to say this. You talk about Islam and Maududi and Qutb. The Christian Science Monitor published a piece in the 1990s saying that Egypt shouldn't bow down to Saudi-style Islam. As a student, I saw fundamentalist students go to Saudi Arabia, come back and distribute books. Saudi-style fundamentalism unnerves Egyptians. Saudi influence must be curbed. The author of that piece was one Mamoun Fandi.
That's true. That's true. That's true. That's true. That's true. Well done. Well done. That's true. I'm still to my point. I'm still to my point that influencing young and so on through money and other things is really should be curbed. However, I have to remind you that there are facts.
Egypt shouldn't bow to a Saudi-style Islam.
Under Mubarak it did.
Under Mubarak it did. Ladies and gentlemen, it's the questions which matter in this part of our Intelligence Squared debate. I want to quickly, there's been a very good question about the nuances. Is there something short of cutting off ties? Yes.
Well, if, for example, I have a say in British foreign policy, I would definitely make the arms sale conditional on Saudi Arabia respecting international norms. I would also lessen the percentage of arms that Saudi Arabia receives from Britain and replace that with exporting our education and our judiciary practices that we are so proud of. Independent judiciary is the key to actually living in peace and having the real security and stability. And on the export of jihadi propaganda, yes, of course, Saudi Arabia is responsible. In 2001, I was doing research on transnational religious links between Saudi Arabia and British Muslims. And I went to one mosque, and what do I see? The Mufti of Saudi Arabia, the head of the religious establishment, preaching to British Muslims in Birmingham, saying to them, you should cut relations with infidels, meaning Christian and Jews. You should not share their celebration during the year 2000 because, God forbid, your heart might soften and you begin to love them. This was preached on satellite television to British Muslims in Birmingham.
Can I just say
you are absolutely right.
One line as a foreign minister
and
of the UK.
British government didn't do anything about it.
Gentlemen.
One line as a foreign minister of the UK. I've always wanted to be the foreign minister of the UK. I would do what Bruce Riedel, former CIA officer, American expert to Saudi Arabia, said. If the US and the UK tonight told King Salman that this war in Yemen has to end, it would end tomorrow because the Royal Saudi Air Force cannot operate without American and British support. Think about that when you vote. Yes. We could end the war tomorrow. We could end the war tomorrow.
Ladies and gentlemen, sadly, discipline is also part of democracy, and we are running against the clock. And believe me, if I had my choice, I would let 3 more of the young idealists with their hands in the air ask more questions. But do join us afterwards and come and ask us your questions. And my apologies as well to the other young idealists in the room who also have their questions. Ladies and gentlemen, now is the time to make your mind-ups. And while you are doing that, it's time to make our summing up speeches. More wisdom from our panel, starting with you, Crispin Blunt.
Saudi Arabia is a horribly complex challenge for the British Foreign Secretary, and in reassessing our relationship with Saudi Arabia, particularly in light of the dreadful murder of Jamal Khashoggi and the detention of these female democracy activists and the detention of all the other activists in the civil society space over the last year or so, is, I think, the crucial ground on which we have got to try and retrieve Saudi Arabia as a voice and a position for progress. And no one should be under any illusion about how difficult a task that is going to be. And much of it is going to turn on the relationship with Mohammed bin Salman, who has collected so many of the levers of power to himself. The private advice that I gave to the Saudis, I knew, was that they needed to learn the history of Henry II and his relationship with Thomas à Becket. Henry II had Thomas à Becket assassinated, and then he went to do penance for that, and then he was a wiser and better king as a consequence. Now, of course, there should be accountability, but then we also, in the hard world of foreign relations and international diplomacy, that has to be also measured with a degree of achievable practicality. Whether that is achievable in Saudi Arabia now, I do not know. Much of it is going to come out of the story that then comes out about the actual culpability of Mohammed bin Salman, what is established for what happened with Jamal Khashoggi. But as far as the whole Saudi Arabian government is concerned, I think it is necessary for us to continue to engage, to try and support progress towards an economic vision of 2030, which I think all should be supported. And it should be a lesson upon those who are trying to make the view about Saudi Arabian society that women in Saudi Arabia have been part of the education and the progress of Saudi Arabia in a way that you will never really hear in a kind of debate like this. And any foreign companies going to want to invest in Saudi Arabia will always usually seek to employ a Saudi Arabia woman first because of the work and contribution they make to their society. Hundreds of thousands, millions of Saudis have now been educated in the West and have inculcated the values of openness and democracy and taken them back home to their country. Are we really going to cut all those ties and end that possibility of progress and a closer alignment of Saudi Arabia with our values.
Thank you.
Yes. Of course, you have been subjected to the Saudi propaganda in the media, regardless of what's been said, that the good Saudi voices are not heard. But when the ban on driving was lifted by Mohammed bin Salman, I wasn't very happy because I knew that if I was in Saudi Arabia, I will be able now to drive myself to prison. So in terms of ties, cutting the ties or not giving the Saudi regime unconditional support, which is my position, I strongly believe that still the British government and other Western governments can exert pressure on Saudi Arabia to respect international law, to treat its own citizens with respect, to give them the opportunity to have a representative government. We have had enough of the rule of princes. The British government, since 1902, when it struck that alliance with the House of Saud, could only think about the tall sheikh, the oil-rich sheikh. And remember, they empowered the Al Saud regime from 1902 until the establishment of the kingdom, supporting them with arms. You just need to go to the Public Record Office and read the archives. And you know to what extent the British government continued to support the House of Saud when it was launching jihad. Yes, the Saudi state is the first jihadi project in the Middle East. It's the first state that was founded on jihad, meaning before they got their attention into the so-called infidels, they were fighting Sunni Muslims, which are the majority in Saudi Arabia, killing people in mosques, and also accusing them of blasphemy to spread the hegemony of the House of Saud. And that was done with the British government support. So I hope today the situation is different, and the British government will rethink its relationship with this regime that it had created at the beginning of the 20th century. And
Mahmoud Fandi, against the motion.
Very difficult.
I don't know if you're getting more sick or less sick with this.
I'm getting more, I'm sickened. As a good Muslim, I like to think, not 100%, but as a good Muslim, I'm very offended actually by the peddling of concepts such as jihad, etc., in Islam that became almost like epithets to trash us publicly, and somehow this is a fad that we are going through. I think this is very offensive. There are 1 billion Muslims who think of the word jihad as Taha Hussein thought of it, as to teach our children, men and women, and send them to university, etc. It's about jihad and nafs, fighting your inner demons, etc. There's amazing things about Islam, and it's a fantastic faith that shouldn't be just trashed the way I listen to it. As Saudi Arabia is just one small part of the Muslim world, and probably the least populated of the Muslim world. Most Muslims are non-Arabs. They live in Indonesia and Malaysia and India, etc. So the idea that somehow Islam, it became an open season on Islam by attacking Saudi Arabia or taking an issue like Jamal Khashoggi and turning it into the way it is. I'm really worried about the excitements of people sometimes. If people were not that excited when the Archduke Ferdinand was killed in Sarajevo, we'd never had World War I. When you take like one personal example and one personal issue and charge it with emotions, and all of a sudden you get too excited and try to push government to make the wrong decisions, I think this is very dangerous. We have to, as Kasper said, we have to think of constructive engagements of countries who might end up being rogue and will change their behavior. We have to inform policies and move countries forward. It's so ironic that as Saudi Arabia opens up, My friend Mehdi quotes me 1990, when I was not really a fan of Saudi Arabia at the time, and I had more hair than this then, and more than Mehdi. But it is that Saudi Arabia that I didn't like. As Saudi Arabia, as it opened up, now it is time to encourage Saudi Arabia to open up even more and inform its policies with reason and become part of the international community rather than isolating it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahmoud Fandi. Mehdi Hassan, back to you. The West should cut ties with Saudi Arabia.
I'll be honest, I preferred the Mahmoud Fandi of 1992, but that's just me. Ladies and gentlemen, my question for you tonight, as you vote, is very simple. Are you going to turn a blind eye to the costs of our ongoing alliance and friendship with one of the most repressive countries in the world, one of the biggest sponsors of terrorism, one of the most reactionary, misogynistic, anti-Semitic, sectarian countries on the planet? Or are you going to vote in favor of what are quite mild consequences for the Saudis? We're not talking about regime change. Crispin did. We didn't bring it up. We're just talking about the cutting of ties, for the ending of red carpets, for the suspension of arms sales. Don't listen to the fear-mongering of the opposition, of Crispin Blunt, who tells us that if we stop selling bombs to Saudi Arabia, there'll be a revolution inside the kingdom, which seems rather bizarre to me. For a man who's such a big supporter of Brexit, he's given us a lot of Project Fear tonight. And this isn't just about human rights. This isn't just about human rights. This is about interests as well. I mentioned earlier Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, a hawk who was once a big backer of Saudi Arabia. He says he cannot carry on supporting Saudi Arabia under reckless MBS. He says we don't want to give a green light to others that they can go down this road. That's what we're asking you to vote for tonight. Don't give them a green light. Vote for consequences. Vote for accountability. Vote for justice. I'm sorry, I know Mamoun doesn't like this, but vote for justice for Jamal. We are talking about real people here. Jamal Khashoggi, who walked into a Saudi consulate in Istanbul 5 months ago, was surrounded by a team of Saudi assassins who put a plastic bag over his head. His last words reportedly were, "Do not cover my mouth. I have asthma. Don't, you will strangle me." Vote for Jamal tonight. Vote for all those names you heard tonight. Vote for the motion. Thank you very much for your time.
Ladies and gentlemen, no matter how you voted tonight, no matter what your view tonight, before the debate or after the debate, you have all, young and old, idealists or cynics, confirmed again the importance, the essential nature of impassioned, inspired, and most of all, of intelligent debate. And such is Intelligence Squared. How did you vote when you came in tonight? 41% of you said you were for the motion that the West should cut ties with Saudi Arabia. 22% of you were against. 37% of you came into Emmanuel Center tonight not quite sure what you thought. And what have you decided at the end of our evening? 63% of you are for the motion. Only 5% were undecided. 32% of you were against the motion. That was a swing, ladies and gentlemen, of 6% for the motion. The West should cut ties with Saudi Arabia. Thank you to our excellent panelists for the motion and against the motion. And thank you to all of you for all of your questions and your participation.